September 14, 1943, Camp 33, Petawawa, Ontario, Canada. The convoy slowed. Gravel crunched under heavy tires. Through gaps in the canvas, 18-year-old Friedrich could see wooden watchtowers rising against pine trees, then the geometric precision of barbed wire catching afternoon light. His hands were still raw from the submarine hatch, salt burns that wouldn't heal on the Atlantic crossing. The smell of diesel mixed with pine resin. Someone in the back of the truck whispered, "Gott im Himmel," God in heaven. But it sounded more like resignation than prayer. The truck stopped. Boots hit gravel, Canadian boots, unhurried. A guard's voice, accented but clear, "Out," formed two lines. Friedrich stepped down. His legs remembered the submarine's cramped quarters, the North African heat, the hold of the Liberty ship. 23 days since U-331 had gone down in the Mediterranean. 23 days of thinking this was temporary, that any moment the war would catch up and swallow them again. Now, this clearing in the wilderness. Barracks in neat rows. A flagpole. Silence. They braced for shouting. For searchlights and dogs. For the chaos they had been trained to expect. The first word they heard was, "Welcome." The gates opened. No shoving. No rifle butts. The Canadian sergeant, gray-haired, wearing the ribbons of the last war, stood with a clipboard and gestured toward a wooden building. "Processing first. Then quarters. You'll have time to wash before supper." Supper. The word landed wrong. Prisoners didn't have supper. They had rations. Bread if you were lucky. Thin soup if you weren't. Friedrich followed the line. Inside the processing building, it smelled like wood polish and cigarette smoke. An officer behind a desk, Canadian Army lieutenant, looked up. Name? Muller. Friedrich. Oberleutnant zur See. The lieutenant wrote it down. No interrogation. No threats. Just paperwork. "You speak English?" "Some." "Good. You'll be in Barrack 7. Red Cross packages arrive monthly. Mail privileges after you're processed. Any medical issues?" Friedrich stared. Medical issues. As though he were checking into a hotel. "The burns?" he said finally, holding up his hands. The lieutenant made a note. "Infirmary after processing. Next." Friedrich moved through. Fingerprints. Photograph. A metal tag with a number. Then a Canadian corporal, too old for overseas duty, wearing a Veterans Guard badge, led him and 5 others across the compound. The other prisoners walked with their heads down, shoulders tight. Waiting for the punishment that made sense. Waiting for the war to reassert itself. The corporal stopped at Barrack 7. "Open the door. Inside. Pick a bunk. Dinner's at 1800. Friedrich stepped through. The barracks was a single large room. 30 double-decker bunks, 15 on each side. A wood stove in the center, already lit, radiating warmth. Windows, actual windows with glass, not bars. And on each bunk, a mattress. Not a board. Not straw in a sack. A mattress. Stripe ticking, plump, resting on metal springs. Friedrich walked to the nearest bunk. Touched it. Pressed down. It compressed under his hand, then sprang back. Behind him, someone laughed. Not joy. Disbelief. "Ich have seit 2 Jahren nicht in einem Bett geschlafen," the man said. "I haven't slept in a bed in 2 years." Klaus, a Panzer Grenadier from the Afrika Korps. Captured at El Alamein, held in Cairo, then shipped across the Atlantic with 1,000 others. He stood there, 19 years old, staring at the mattress like it might vanish. "Neither have I," Friedrich said. The corporal was still in the doorway. Blankets in the footlockers. 2 per man. Inspections at 0700, but nobody's going to bother you tonight. Get some rest. He left. The door closed. The 6 Germans stood in silence, alone for the first time in weeks, surrounded by mattresses and heat and the smell of fresh wood. Friedrich sat on the lower bunk. The springs creaked. He lay back slowly, testing whether this was real. The mattress held him. His spine, which had forgotten what softness felt like, began to remember. "They're going to take it away," someone muttered. "This is a test." But no one came. Outside, boots crunched past on patrol. A whistle blew somewhere, routine, not alarm. The wood stove crackled. If this moment already feels impossible, stay with us. What comes next will reshape everything you thought you knew about prisoners and power. Friedrich Müller had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1941, 17 years old, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. They all were. He trained on U-boats, cramped steel tubes that smelled like diesel and sweat and fear. His first patrol had been in the Atlantic. His second, the Mediterranean. On September 17, 1943, U-331 had been hunting Allied convoys off the Algerian coast when a British aircraft spotted them on the surface. The torpedo from an RAF Albacore hit amidships. The sub went down in minutes. 15 survivors. Pulled from the water by British sailors who gave them blankets and tea. Then a week in Algiers. Then a Liberty ship to New York. Then trains north into Canada, through landscapes so vast they seemed empty of war entirely. Klaus Bergmann, the Panzer Grenadier in the bunk above Friedrich, had a different story. Drafted in 1942. Sent to North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps. Fought at El Alamein, where the British 8th Army shattered the German lines. Captured in November 1942. Held in a makeshift camp in the Egyptian desert. Canvas tents, 120-degree heat, sand and everything. 6 months there. Then the same Atlantic crossing, the same trains. Both had expected execution or labor camps. Both had been told that Anglo-American forces tortured prisoners. Both had spent the journey bracing for cruelty. Both were now lying on mattresses in a heated barracks in the Canadian wilderness, waiting for the punishment that never came. At 1800 hours, a whistle blew. The corporal returned. Dinner. Follow me. They walked to the mess hall, a long wooden building with the same clean-swept floors, the same warmth. Inside, rows of tables. Other prisoners already seated, submariners, Luftwaffe pilots, infantry. Maybe 200 men. The noise was subdued. Forks on metal plates. Low conversation. Friedrich joined the line. A Canadian cook, civilian, older, wearing an apron, stood behind steam tables. He looked up. Tray. Friedrich held out his metal tray. The cook spooned potatoes onto it. Mashed with butter melting into the center. Then sauerkraut, real sauerkraut, not the rancid slop from the U-boat. Then a slab of meat. Pork maybe. Or beef. Thick enough to require a knife. Friedrich stared at the tray. At the portion. It was more food than he'd seen in a week on the submarine. More food than he'd had in Cairo. Bread's on the tables, the cook said. Coffee too. Move along. Friedrich sat. Klaus slid in across from him. They looked at their trays. It's poisoned, Klaus said quietly. It's not. Then it's a trick. They're going to starve us tomorrow. But Friedrich was already eating. The potatoes tasted like potatoes, salt, butter, the faint minerality of real food. The meat was tough but real. The sauerkraut was sour and crisp. Around them, other prisoners ate in the same stunned silence. A few talked, comparing camps, comparing stories. Most just ate. At the end of the table, a Luftwaffe pilot, older, maybe 30, still wearing his flight jacket, leaned over. You just arrive? Friedrich nodded. From where? U-boat. Mediterranean. The pilot smiled grimly. I was shot down over England. Held in Scotland for 6 months. Then here. This, he gestured at the mess hall. This is not what we were told. What were we told? That the Allies were barbarians. That surrender meant death. Friedrich looked at his tray. At the bread still warm. At the cup of coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory they'd had on the boat. They lied, the pilot said. About a lot of things. That first night, Friedrich lay on his mattress and listened to the camp settle. The wood stove popped. Someone snored. Outside, a guard walked the perimeter, boots on gravel, steady and slow. No shouting. No dogs. He thought about his mother in Hamburg. About the letters he'd written from Algiers that she'd never receive. About whether she knew he was alive. The Geneva Convention he'd heard in processing, guaranteed male privileges. He could write. She would know. I did not expect kindness. I did not expect cruelty. I expected war, and war has rules. But this is something different. It is order without hatred. Discipline without rage. I do not know what to call it. He pulled the blanket, thick wool reel, up to his chin. The mattress held him. The warmth soaked in. For the first time in 2 years, Friedrich Müller slept without dreaming of drowning. The system that governed Camp 33 and the 39 other POW camps scattered across Canada was not built on sentiment. It was built on 3 pillars, each as pragmatic as it was principled. Security. Keeping prisoners contained, yes, but also keeping them healthy, occupied, and unlikely to riot. Malnutrition bred desperation. Desperation bred escapes, violence, chaos. The Canadian government, tasked by Britain with housing thousands of German POWs far from the European theater, had no interest in managing rebellion. Diplomacy. Every parcel, every privilege, every inspection by the International Red Cross sent a message to Berlin. Canada treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Berlin, holding Canadian POWs, was expected to reciprocate. The calculus was cold and clear: your men are safe because ours must be. Morality. Not kindness. Restraint. The camps were run by veterans' guards, men who had fought in the last war, who had seen what war did, who knew that cruelty was a choice, not a necessity. They guarded prisoners with rifles but no dogs. They enforced order but not terror. A memo circulated in 1940, signed by the Minister of National Defense, had been precise: prisoners are soldiers, not criminals. Treat them accordingly. 5 words. Treat them accordingly. Friedrich learned the rules on his second day. Wake at 6. Roll call at 7. Work details assigned after breakfast: timber crews, farm labor, camp maintenance. Officers were exempt from manual labor per the Geneva Convention, but even they were expected to keep their quarters in order. Mail could be sent and received, though censored. Red Cross packages arrived monthly: chocolate, cigarettes, toiletries. Prisoners could buy additional items at the canteen using scrip earned from labor. It was a routine. Predictable. Orderly. And it worked. Within a week, Friedrich stopped waiting for the punishment. The camp had a rhythm, and the rhythm was mundane. Breakfast at 07:30, porridge, bread, coffee. Work until noon. Lunch, soup, more bread. Work until 4. Dinner at 6. Evenings were theirs: cards, books from the library, makeshift concerts organized by prisoners who'd been musicians before the war. The barracks, which had felt surreal on that first night, became familiar. The mattress stopped being a miracle and became a bed. The wood stove stopped being a luxury and became warmth. Friedrich was assigned to a logging crew. 20 prisoners, 2 Canadian guards, and a forest full of spruce and pine. The work was hard: felling trees, stripping branches, hauling timber to trucks. But it was work with a purpose. The guards didn't shout. They showed the prisoners how to use the axes safely, how to avoid widowmakers, how to pace themselves so exhaustion didn't kill anyone. At lunch they ate together, prisoners and guards sitting on stumps sharing thermoses of coffee. One of the guards, a man named Thompson who'd lost 2 fingers at Vimy Ridge, told stories about logging camps he'd worked in before the war. "You boys aren't the first Germans I've met," he said. "Worked with plenty in the 20s. Good loggers, most of them." Friedrich didn't know how to respond. The propaganda had been clear: Canadians hated Germans. The war was a race war, a cultural war, a war of annihilation. But Thompson just drank his coffee and watched the trees. "War's war," he said finally. "But work's work. You fell a tree right, it don't matter where you're from." Klaus Bergmann, the Panzer Grenadier, struggled more. He'd been a true believer, raised in the Hitler Youth, trained to see the world as a battlefield of ideology. At night, he'd lie in his bunk and mutter about betrayal, about how Germany would win, about how this was all a trick. But during the day the trick didn't reveal itself. The guards didn't beat anyone. The food kept coming. The mail arrived. In October, Klaus received his first letter from home. His mother, writing from Dusseldorf. The envelope had been opened, censored, but the letter inside was intact. She was alive. His sister was alive. The city was bombed, but they were alive. Klaus sat on his bunk and read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his footlocker. That night, Friedrich heard him crying. The next morning, Klaus was quieter. He still worked the logging crew. He still ate in the mess hall. But something had shifted. "She says they're starving," Klaus said at lunch, staring at his sandwich: white bread, real butter, sliced ham. "They are," Thompson said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Klaus looked at the sandwich. At the food he'd taken for granted all week. At the evidence that whatever propaganda had said about Allied brutality, it hadn't accounted for this: that in Canada, even prisoners ate better than civilians in Germany. "It's not fair," Klaus said. "No," Thompson agreed. "It's not." But fairness wasn't the point. Survival was. As autumn turned to winter, the camp adjusted. Snow came early, thick, silent, burying the compound in white. The prisoners, many from southern Germany or the Mediterranean theater, had never seen snow like this. The Canadians issued wool coats, gloves, boots. The work details shifted. Less logging, more camp maintenance, snow removal, repairs. Christmas approached. The prisoners organized a concert. A violinist from Munich. A choir of submariners who'd sung together in the North Atlantic. A pianist, one of the Luftwaffe pilots, who played Schubert on an old upright hauled into the mess hall. The Canadian guards attended. They sat in the back listening. When the choir sang Still Nacht, Silent Night, some of the guards sang along in English. Same melody. Same yearning. After the concert, the camp commandant, a major named Carrington, 50ish with a limp from the Somme, stood and addressed the room. "Gentlemen," he said, "I know this is not where you want to be. I know you'd rather be home. But you are here and you are under my care, and I will see that you are treated justly. That is all." He sat down. No speeches about brotherhood. No false cheer. Just acknowledgement. The prisoners clapped. Not enthusiastically. But they clapped. If you're beginning to see how restraint can reshape belief, subscribe now, because the next part will show you what happens when ideology meets reality, and reality refuses to lie. In January 1944, a new group of prisoners arrived. Hardened SS officers from the Eastern Front. They were different, colder, angrier, more committed. The Canadian administration separated them immediately, sending them to a different compound within Camp 33, isolating them from the general population. Friedrich and Klaus heard the rumors. The SS prisoners refused to work. They organized resistance. They enforced Nazi hierarchy within their barracks, punishing anyone who cooperated with the Canadians. One of the SS officers, transferred briefly to the main compound, tried to rally the prisoners during a meal. "We are soldiers of the Reich," he declared, standing on a bench. "We do not collaborate. We do not accept charity from our enemies." The mess hall went quiet. 200 prisoners, forks frozen mid-bite. A submariner near Friedrich, a man named Otto, 42, who'd been a merchant marine before the war, stood up. "Sit down," Otto said. The SS officer glared. "You are a coward." "I am alive," Otto replied. "My family knows I am alive. I sleep in a bed. I eat food. I follow the rules of war. That is not cowardice. That is sanity." The SS officer spat. "You have forgotten the Führer." Otto didn't flinch. "The Führer is not here. I am." The guards moved in before it could escalate. The SS officer was removed. The mess hall resumed eating. But the moment had mattered. Because it wasn't the Canadians who had silenced the ideology. It was the prisoners themselves, men who had seen enough, endured enough, to recognize that fanaticism was a luxury they could no longer afford. Personal stories emerged slowly in fragments, like fossils surfacing from sediment. There was Ernst, 21, a radio man from a U-boat. He'd been at sea for 18 months straight before capture. He told Friedrich one night, sitting by the wood stove, that he'd forgotten what silence sounded like. The engine noise, the sonar pings, the water. It never stopped. Even when I slept, I heard it. But here, he gestured at the barracks. Here it's quiet. I can hear myself think. I don't know if that's good or bad. Some nights I lie awake and listen to nothing. It frightens me more than the depth charges ever did. There was Hans, a Luftwaffe mechanic, 34, captured in Sicily. He'd been a machinist before the war, building engines for tractors. He worked in the camp's maintenance shop, repairing generators and heaters. One day, a Canadian engineer showed him a diesel engine that wouldn't start. Hans fixed it in 20 minutes. The engineer thanked him, genuinely, without condescension. Hans stood there, wrench in hand, realizing that competence still mattered even here, even now. I thought the war would erase who I was. But they let me be a mechanic. Not a German. Not a prisoner. Just a mechanic. There was Wilhelm, a 19-year-old infantryman from Bavaria. He'd been drafted in 1942, sent to North Africa, captured at Tobruk. He'd spent 6 months in Egypt, then 6 months in transit, and now 6 months in Canada. He told Klaus during a logging shift that he couldn't remember his mother's face anymore. I have her letters. I know what she looks like. But I can't see her. It's like a photograph that's faded. Klaus didn't answer. But that night he sat with Wilhelm at dinner and talked about home. Not about the war, not about politics, just about the village where Wilhelm grew up, the church with the crooked steeple, the river where he used to fish. Slowly the memory came back. And there was Jacob, an older man, 48, a reservist who'd been called up in desperation. He'd been a schoolteacher. Captured in Italy. He organized a school in the camp, teaching mathematics, history, languages to younger prisoners who'd left school at 16 to enlist. The Canadians provided paper and pencils. Jacob taught 3 nights a week in a corner of the mess hall. The war will end. Whether we win or lose, it will end. And these boys need to know something other than how to kill. They need to know how to live. Spring arrived late but sudden. The snow melted in a week, turning the compound into mud. The logging crews went back into the forest. The mail came more regularly. And rumors began circulating. Italy had surrendered. The Allies had landed in France. Berlin was being bombed. The prisoners listened to the rumors with a mix of dread and hope. Dread because they knew what bombing meant. Hope because it meant the war might end. In June 1944, the Canadians allowed the prisoners to listen to a radio broadcast, heavily monitored, translated into German. The announcer described the Normandy landings, the Allied advance, the collapse of German defenses. The prisoners sat in silence. No cheers. No protests. Just the weight of inevitability settling in. Klaus, sitting beside Friedrich, whispered, "It's over." "Not yet," Friedrich said. "Soon." That night, Klaus wrote a letter to his mother. Friedrich didn't read it, but he watched Klaus write and rewrite and finally seal the envelope. The next morning, Klaus handed it to the mail clerk without comment. Whatever he'd written, it wasn't propaganda. It was goodbye to something. Maybe the war, maybe the belief that the war had meant anything at all. In August, one of the guards, Thompson, the logger with the missing fingers, brought a newspaper to the worksite. He showed the prisoners a photograph, ruins of a German city. Hamburg, maybe, or Dresden. Rubble and smoke. "That's what you're going back to," Thompson said quietly. "When this is over." Friedrich looked at the photograph. He thought about his mother. About whether her house was still standing. "I know," Friedrich said. Thompson folded the newspaper. "You boys are lucky to be here." "I know," Friedrich said again. And he meant it. Because luck in war wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. And survival, he'd learned in the 2 years since the submarine went down, required letting go of the idea that the world owed you fairness or glory or even meaning. Survival required accepting what was in front of you, a bed, a meal, a routine, and holding on. Christmas 1944 was quieter than the year before. The prisoners knew the war was ending. They knew what that meant. Some would return to homes that no longer existed. Some would face trials for what they'd done. Some would simply disappear into the chaos of post-war Europe. But on Christmas Eve, the mess hall filled again. The violinist played. The choir sang. The Canadians brought in extra food, turkey, cranberries, potatoes. A feast by any standard, absurd by the standards of wartime rationing. Major Carrington stood as he had the year before and addressed the room. "Next Christmas," he said, "you will not be here. You will be home or somewhere else rebuilding. I hope you remember this place not as a prison but as a refuge. I hope you remember that even in war there are rules, and that following those rules is not weakness. It is civilization." He sat down. The prisoners clapped. Longer this time. Not for him. For the year they'd survived. For the beds they'd slept in. For the food they'd eaten. For the letters they'd received. For the restraint that had kept them human. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Friedrich heard about it from a guard who rushed into the barracks, shouting. The prisoners assembled in the yard. Major Carrington read the announcement. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The prisoners stood at attention. The senior German officer, a captain from the Luftwaffe, ordered them to sing the national anthem. They sang. But they didn't sing the Nazi verse. They sang the old anthem, the one from before. Then they went back to their barracks. That night, Friedrich lay on his mattress, the same mattress from 2 years ago still holding him, and thought about home. About what home would look like. About whether it would still exist. He didn't cry. He didn't celebrate. He simply lay there, listening to the camp settle into its final routine and waited. Repatriation began in late 1945. The prisoners were processed, given travel papers and sent home in waves. Some went willingly. Others hesitated. A few, about 6,000 across all the camps, applied to stay in Canada permanently. They had skills. They had no homes to return to. Canada needed workers. Friedrich Müller was repatriated in December 1945. He returned to Hamburg. His mother's house was gone, bombed in 1943. She'd survived, living with relatives in the countryside. He found her there. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. He worked as a mechanic. Rebuilt engines. Married. Had children. Never talked about the war except in the vaguest terms. But once, late in life, he told his grandson about Camp 33. About the mattress. About the food. About the Canadians who guarded him without cruelty. They didn't love us, he said. But they didn't hate us either. And that was enough. Klaus Bergman stayed in Canada. He applied for immigration in 1946, was accepted and settled in Ontario. He worked as a logger, the same work he'd done as a prisoner. He learned English. He became a citizen. He never returned to Germany. He died in 1998, 73 years old, in a nursing home in Ottawa. His obituary mentioned that he was a veteran of World War II. It did not mention which side. In 1971, the Canadian government, at the request of the German War Graves Commission, moved the remains of the 137 German POWs who had died in Canadian custody to a military cemetery in Kitchener, Ontario. The ceremony was formal, respectful. Families from Germany attended. The graves were marked with simple granite headstones, 2 men per grave. The cemetery is still there. Quiet. Well kept. Rarely visited. But it exists. A reminder that even in war, even among enemies, there were those who chose restraint over rage. Civilization over cruelty. If this story has shown you the power of discipline over hatred, subscribe, because understanding how systems can preserve humanity under pressure is one of the most important lessons history offers. Camp 33 was decommissioned in 1946. The barracks were dismantled. The watchtowers torn down. The site returned to forest. Today there's a plaque near the highway marking the location. Most drivers pass without noticing. But the men who were held there, the ones who survived, the ones who stayed, the ones who returned, carried the memory with them. Not as trauma. Not as triumph. Just as a strange, undeniable fact. That for 2 years in the middle of a war that killed 60 million people, they had been treated not as monsters, not as victims, but as men. The Geneva Convention, signed in 1929, updated in 1949, remains one of the most important documents in human history. It does not rely on love. It does not rely on mercy. It relies on rules. Rules that say, a prisoner is a soldier, not a slave. A prisoner has rights not as a gift but as a condition of war. A prisoner is fed, housed, allowed to write home, not because the captor is kind but because the captor is bound by law. Canada in World War II followed those rules. Not perfectly. Not without exception. But consistently enough that 34,000 German prisoners survived their captivity and went home. That is not a small thing. There is a photograph from Camp 33, taken in 1944. A group of prisoners standing outside a barracks, smiling. Not propaganda smiles. Real ones. Behind them, a Canadian guard leans against a wall, smoking a cigarette, relaxed. The photograph was found in an archive in 2003, part of a collection donated by a former guard's family. It was digitized, catalogued, and filed under POW Camps, Canada, World War II. No one in the photograph is named. No one knows who they were or what became of them. But the photograph exists. And it tells a story that propaganda cannot. That in the worst war in human history, some men chose order over chaos. Restraint over revenge. Humanity over hatred. Not because it was easy, but because it was possible. Friedrich Müller's grandson, visiting Canada in 2015, drove to Petawawa. He found the plaque marking Camp 33. He stood there for a long time trying to imagine the barracks, the prisoners, the guards. He couldn't. The forest had reclaimed it all. But he thought about his grandfather's story. About the mattress. About the food. About the Canadians who had kept him alive when the world was burning. And he understood finally what his grandfather had meant when he said, "They didn't love us. But they didn't hate us either." That space between love and hate, that refusal to dehumanize, even when dehumanization would have been easy, is what civilization looks like under pressure. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is a bed. A meal. A letter home. A rule followed. And sometimes that is enough. The submarine had taught him to drown. The camp taught him to sleep.